What can go wrong? What can go wrong?
If you have an outsourcer and if they think they can reduce the amount of people and actually speed things up, that's a value to them.
Required for the first time, I think, a competitive end user-based service.
So WannaCry came about, and from some organization's perspective, everything was fine, but they had no visibility really into the vendors, other suppliers.
So I'm joined by Brian Spring. Brian Spring is responsible for our security operations practice for ANZ. I'm just going to ask Brian some questions around service integration and management. Welcome, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
There's some questions I get a lot in the security space around controls and policies, and I know that you deal with things like global risk and compliance as well as security. But from a sort of multi-source perspective, what are some of the risks that you see when organizations take their IT and they outsource to a bunch of providers? What can go wrong?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that you get lose data. That's the first thing. The second thing is that infrastructure can go down, right? So there's different risks that you can actually inherit from that specific, let's say, provider. Another thing is that those organizations as well they actually may be breached, so that's yet another type of risk. So organizations put controls into place so that they can actually manage it and manage those specific types of risk. And again, those are associated with policies, right? So there's certain policies that are set forward. So there may be internal policies. So maybe the customer may say, we have specific policies in place, whether it's from an external perspective or internal perspective. And they have to be able to manage to those. So they would have specific, like ISO 27000, right? There's certain controls that are actually associated with it. And those controls, if they go out of whack, then what could actually happen is that, for example, they can actually open up a security incident. If you think of an organization that, let's say, is attacked, there should be controls that are in place, right? And so with respect to those controls, and they're following these controls because they're really trying to protect the organization. So with respect, so in terms of these specific controls, there's internal policies that are set, and the controls govern to that, and also there's external type of policies that organizations would follow, like in ISO 27000. Well, if you just talk about risk, right, just for a second, if you talk about risk, from the way we see things, so there's basically, you have your internal risk organization who's always trying to ensure that risk score is quite low, right? But then if they have a really good posture in terms of risk internally, well, what about those third parties that you're talking about? So you have to be able to manage. You have to be able to manage those specific for those specific vendors. So that you're just trying to minimize the risk of. So for example, if there was a breach of some sort.
So just say you're a bank and you decide to move to a SaaS-based marketing application, right? That has customer data in it. It might have service information, maybe not credit cards, maybe credit cards. You would have specific controls and policies, or policies with underpinning controls for that specific vendor, right? And that would then go into a big bucket of other policies and controls that need to be centrally managed.
Yeah.
How is that managed today? Is it bunch of spreadsheets?
I think that a lot of it is probably done via spreadsheet, and it's done in a manual type of fashion. Some of the larger banks will have different processes in place, and they probably have some solutions that they've been leveraging for a little while. But the question becomes, there's more risk, or there's more threat that's out there. There's going to be more things that have to be checked or controlled and be monitored.
And it just keeps going, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got microservices now where you've got specific vendors doing just a niche service that underpins maybe other 3 or 4 services. It must be like horrific.
Yeah. So if you think about it, the more complex it becomes, the more there is actually, not only with a number of different vendors, but also you'll be checking or controlling more, or looking at the risks a little bit more in detail, and there'll be more of them, and there'll be more to do. And so, it just isn't scalable, right? So you have to pick basically, let's say top tier in terms of your providers. But what about the
Your
tier
tier
2,
two, tier three.
right, exactly. So I think the idea is that, and one of the things that, of course, that we were able to do really well is that we were able to leverage automation.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why, we're in a pretty good spot in terms of looking at risk, whether it's internal and you're managing internal risks, whether, like we were talking before about, let's say the risk of potentially, let's say, losing data, or the risk of, even actually being breached or there's some sort of outbreak, right? And then also controls that are actually that underpin, or actually the controls that actually govern what actually should be in place so you can actually minimize that risk.
Okay, because we talk a lot on the sort of IT operations side around service level management and using monitoring and so on for all of the events and so on. But what you're talking about is actually managing these policy or these controls that could be based on data access, right? So log data, or it could be some kind of a security type tool that's going out and checking stuff. Talk to me a little bit about that side of it, like the more.
Yeah, so I guess the way we kind of look at it, I guess we kind of look at it in two different fronts, right? And so the first thing is that we talked a little bit about this before, controls, right? Yeah. There's specific controls. So if you think about, again, internal controls, which are basically some policies that have been put in place to make sure that we're minimizing if there's going to be any damage, right? So there's internal, and then there's also external. So like we said before, like the different standards are out there. So if you talk about PCI, SOX, or HIPAA, or any of those types of things come with a set of controls that you need to be able to monitor and manage to ensure that the organization is actually in alignment, or that it's safe, right? So that's internal. But if you look at external controls, just like we were saying before, the external controls are your other vendors, right? So let's take WannaCry as a classic example, right? So WannaCry came about, and from some organization's perspective, everything was fine, but they had no visibility really into the vendors or their suppliers in terms of if they were actually compliant, right? And so what we talked about before in terms of automation and things of that nature, that is a manual process that is just kind of it's kind of a disaster. They can't keep on top of it. So again, the controls, with the policies, whether it's internal or external. Let's talk about the other side, which is around risk, right? So there's what's called a risk register, and that risk register registers all the risks from an organization in terms of whether it's like data, whether it is access, or whether it may be, right, or even vulnerabilities, right? Yeah. So from a vulnerability perspective, if there are certain vulnerabilities within an organization, those vulnerabilities should go up into what's called the risk register, or in effect the risk score, right? And so you should need to be able to manage that risk score by actually going through the operational wherewithal of actually getting rid of the specific vulnerabilities. So I don't know if I answered your question, but we look at it in those two formats because not only are we able to provide a level of, I guess, insight in automation and remediation, but it's a full circle as well. Yeah. Right? Vulnerability, scan the vulnerability, you go through the vulnerability, the remediation process, and let's say that those vulnerabilities don't get, let's say, wiped out, that affects the risk score, right? But also with the policies, you have controls that are associated with it, and let's say the control is being monitored and it's out of whack, what's going to happen? You're going to open up a security incident based on the type of control. Okay. So there's this constant loop. Yeah.
And it's a bit like a hamster wheel. That's what I'm hearing. So because it's so manual. Now that and it really made me think about something else. So in order to check this, if it's not automated and it's spreadsheet based, and we're sort of relying on the outsourcer to provide that information, then I guess the biggest tool in the arsenal for these organizations is audit. Right? They need to be auditing or checking this manually to make sure that there's compliance by the vendors or by the retained organization. So, one thing that I can't help but think about, if they get an external auditor, like a PwC or one of those guys, and they find something, like you mentioned that risk score around the vulnerabilities, if they air that up to the board level and the directors or the board don't actually action that risk in some way, if it was within their power to go and remediate, that's a director's liability. That's an issue, a personal liability on the part of the board members. Do you see how do people mitigate that? That
Well,
sounds.
I mean, I think one of the probably the big issues that we're seeing is that there's not, first of all, there's not full visibility. So when you're talking about having, let's say, that full visibility for the board, that is a manual process in its own. But let's even take it a step further. Each of the organizations at IT, whether it's IT or the applications organization or let's say legal or finance, they all have their own little world in terms of trying to manage that as well, manage risk. And so you have these different silos, and ultimately that information has to be brought up and somehow aggregated up. But it's all manual process.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some organizations that are doing some things around it and managing it, but it's all a manual process to understand that.
Okay, no, that's useful.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm thinking about this stuff is if you're, say, transitioning a vendor out, say an infrastructure vendor, or you're getting one in, it sounds like there's a bit of work that goes on during that sort of procurement cycle or that supply management, vendor management cycle to go and identify these potential risks. But the issue is then how they managed in an ongoing fashion, how they revised, maybe like we started the service with this contract, but then we added stuff to it. So actually the profile of the vendor or the risk profile has changed.
Yeah.
So what I see as a potential way to overcome this is when you get the vendor in to begin with, that you come up with some means to automatically manage that contract, or mitigate that risk.
Yeah. So when a new vendor comes on board, or even if you have an existing vendor, and even if their contract changes, based on what they're actually providing as that service, right? There's probably going to be a different risk profile, right? And so the good news is that we have a great solution to actually help manage that. So you may have a specific vendor, and there's specific things that they must adhere to. Right, and if the contract changes, there are other things that they have to adhere to, and those are in the form of whether it's different parts of compliance or different areas that they have to basically follow that they can actually push out directly to the vendors, or have a vendor go to a portal as an example, and basically manage from their end exactly what it is that they must adhere to.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I guess
what I'm saying is that based on what they're actually providing as a service, there's going to be specific. I guess there's going to be a risk profile, and that risk profile is going to deem that they have to follow specific, let's say, policies, so that they're actually in compliance with the organization. But that can actually change, and they can actually, it can change, and there may be additional work for the vendor to actually go through to prove that they're actually in compliance.
So this is the thing I don't get, right? It'd be good just to talk about it. These vendors that are in there, they're providing this stuff up manually at high cost of producing the manual reports, digging out information. They're then subject to an audit. Hugely manual on their side.
Yeah.
Yet I don't get why they wouldn't be striving to put automation in so that they can provide that immediately. Like I use the example of license compliance, right? Software license compliance. If Oracle knock on the door of the end customer and say, "Hey, I don't trust you to have the right license profile," they then have to go to the outsourcer and say, "Give me the licensing position," and often they'll go and generate a manual report.
Yeah.
So I just don't understand, why wouldn't it be in the outsourcer's interest to provide all of that data automatically? Why do we constantly get the situation where it's the end customer having to ask for it, and it's not just automatically posted?
And it's been basically negotiated into the contract, because you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
We've seen with a couple of our customers now that the lights actually kind of come on, because they had, with respect to their outsourcers, they had no visibility, and I'm talking specifically from a security perspective, but they have no visibility into, for example, how many security incidents are there? How many are on the go? When are those security incidents going to be resolved? Or how many vulnerabilities are out? They're not given that visibility. They don't know what the process is that the organization or the outsourcer is going through. And these are things that actually can impact the risk of the organization, who are accountable, but you have the providers that are actually the ones that are doing it. So we'll send a text, or we'll send a report, and so I think the customer has to demand a level of visibility and reporting, because they're accountable. and the provider should be able to provide that. I think some of the challenges are there's contracts that are already been negotiated.
Okay, so and then I think, I mean, I can kind of assume what we see is it's a previously negotiated agreement. The world's moved on. There's better tooling, better automation, but that has a cost. And if I'm the outsourcer, so do I have to go and bear that cost? I'm already providing a minimal service level around that data, and I'm providing it manually, and maybe that's the cost profile, and it might be more expensive to get the automation to go and do it.
Yeah.
I don't really understand why this is still an issue, but it's something. It's always there.
It's a simple. It's a cost thing, and it's an upskilling thing. And listen, we have customers who have purchased our software, even though they have an outsourced service, and having this provider leverage the solution that they purchased. Yeah. For a couple of different reasons. One, the customer is going to get the visibility they need, but also in the end, they're going to get a better service from that outsourcer. So they would want to invest. So it comes down to, for example, the cost, right? So and also, well, it comes down to the cost, but it also comes down to does that service provider want to provide a better service? And I think those two things are, they could be definitely negotiable. But like I said before, we've seen customers that actually purchased our solutions so that ultimately the service provider is going to give them a better service in the end because they're allowing them to use that as a part of the service.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to figure out what the answer is, and it might be, at the end of the day, the risk is still with the end customer. You're outsourcing, but it's your name that's going to be in the press, right? If you're an airliner, it's you guys that are going to be front page, not the outsourcer, right? So really, I think the ball is very much in the end customer's court to go and make sure they have the right controls and that they're automated and that they're enforceable. And this sometimes I see with the end customer that they're like going, well, hang on, I've already paid for that service, so why should I go and buy tooling? They should be giving that to me.
Yeah.
But then the outsourcer is like, well, it's not in my contract, so you have to pay for it. And so you get this situation where neither party wants to pay for that extra level of governance, but yet then you're in an impasse.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so then the governance just doesn't happen, which is adding so much extra risk and cost, and end customers are being affected. Which I think that's part of the crux of why these big organizations are getting subjected to competition by the smaller, more nimble players who don't have this problem.
Well, I think that there's also something else that really hasn't been addressed too. So, when you have one organization that says, well, we're providing this specific service because that's what you guys are paying us to do, and we have this sort of service level, and then you have the other side that we don't want to pay for we don't want to pay for solutions. We just want a better service.
They want an outcome no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. They want an outcome, and a lot of times they may not be getting it. But where you can actually come together, and this is what we've seen with one of our customers, where they come together, there's one thing that actually drives both, and it's operational efficiency. If you have an outsourcer and if they think they can reduce the amount of people and actually speed things up, that's a value to them. But also on, let's say, the customer side, for them, they're going to get a better service, and by the way, it's going to cost less. Yeah. Right? So it's almost like you can actually go through a renegotiation of your contract, because if you have automation that's put in place, then it's going to benefit both.
Okay, that's a really good point, and I think the other aspect of that is sometimes it probably suits the vendor for it to be a little bit grey, because that big magnifying glass that some of these new tools provide, like whether it's a Qualys or a Splunk or whatever, monitoring or discovery, that's like putting a big spotlight on what they're doing. So you're right, there needs to be a payoff. It needs to be operational efficiency, or even, hey, we're a safer pair of hands. Give us more services. We can do more. Look at how we've mitigated risk or whatever.
And I think
that there has to be a carrot in it.
Yeah, there's an advanced. That's advanced thinking. And again, we've seen it as well. And that's why, again, the customer has purchased, for example, our Secops solution, because they know that they're going to get that efficiency, and they're going to be able to. And if they're able to actually provide a little bit more automation, then the service provider is going to be able to actually do more and actually protect their organization even further. So it's a benefit for both sides, right?
Okay, so you brought up just a point there around maturity. I think it's a maturity thing as well that plays a part, and I see different customers that are at different levels of thinking. One is like, hey, it's not my problem, it's the outsourcer, it's their fault, if they're and others where they've maybe understanding they need to trust but inspect, right? Or have that more of that kind of mindset. It's on me as well. I need to make sure that I make them successful, and we need to work together collaboratively to give our customers a better experience. And I think this is really the crux of it, right? We're seeing the situation now where they're having to bring more in-house, retained, build, provide for the first time, I think, a competitive end user-based service. And that's why we're seeing in B2C, especially, online banking, boom, apps, because otherwise you've got these little startups that'll come out of nowhere and you can, change the whole game. Look at Yellow Pages, right? But anyway, there's other examples, Uber, so on and so forth. I've seen a number of organizations look at changing their operating model and trying to come up with a more team, collaborative, agile methodology to sort of combat this growing competition from some of these smaller companies. How could they apply that thinking to some of the things we've been talking about from a risk perspective? So is there kind of an agile way to start looking at this? Maybe different services have different ways of managing?
Well, I think that I think that right now the smaller organizations, there's pros and cons of being a smaller organization. The pros is that they're more agile. The cons is that there's not enough people. So if you look at it from that perspective, from a not enough people perspective, you have all the parts of the organization kind of have to work together. And to ensure that they're actually really working together, because they still, even in a smaller organization, they're still in their own silos. You still have to implement, for example, task management and automation and things of that nature, right? So it's an advantage actually to have a platform so that you can have everybody in that platform be accountable for something, whether it's a specific task or sharing of information or whatever it may be. So in our space, especially with the smaller organizations, there may be two guys in security. They have to leverage other parts of the organization so that they can actually remediate much faster.
So
automation helps with that, right?
So they're using automation. They've got newer capabilities. They're not subject to the big technology debt. They don't have aging, infrastructure. That's really the key point, right? So they're looking at a more sort of collaborative, agile, automated way to manage these problems. So I guess that's really the challenge for some of the bigger organizations, is how do they adopt some of that thinking.
You just have a lot of people in some organizations versus a couple in the smaller organizations, and a lot of times the ones in the smaller organizations, if like I said, they're leveraging automation, they're going to be effective. They're going to be effective.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks.
No worries.
All right.